So Peter's right. We've changed a few things. We've emphasized some of the issues around education and think about fungi in the future. They're not going to go away. We've got to make sure we don't go away. And so the first session is an interesting session, I think, which is trying to look at this legacy or look at this ongoing issues around workforce, around the new generations. And it's called Growing and Retaining the Medical Mycology Research Workforce. An extraordinary important issue, and I have three speakers coming from different backgrounds on these particular subjects. And so again, think as they present what they want to tell you about, how you could ask them questions, tweak them, bring new things out. Again, as Pete says, it's a working meeting. All this stuff is recorded. All of it is taken down. And some of the things that you say may be extraordinarily important to the future of how the MSG moves forward. So with the first speaker, it's on a topic of recruiting and diversifying the ID physician scientist workforce from internal medicine residency into infectious diseases. And I deal with, as a division chief, I deal with this daily. In fact, I should be at home with my recruiting of my new group, but I'm here with you guys. And so this is a talk by Melia, and Michael, it is all yours.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. As I appreciate the emphasis on education for the meeting, I primarily identify as an educator, and we don't often get invited to meetings like this. So it's really, honestly, it's a great honor to be here with you to talk a little bit about the recruiting and diversifying the ID workforce. And so what I have no relevant financial disclosures. And so what I hope to do with this talk is just actually to try to prevent some of the relevant data, and then hopefully this will serve to fuel discussion during the Q&A about some of the stuff that I talk about. So I'm going to go fairly quickly over the information on this slide, but I hope that by the end of my time that everybody here will be able to describe and discuss data pertaining to ID fellowship match rates, the national need for ID physicians, reasons that trainees might or might not pursue careers within infectious diseases, talk a bit about the impact of the COVID pandemic on recruitment into ID, and then end with some discussion about diversity, both from the perspectives of sex and race and ethnicity across internal medicine faculty, internal medicine subspecialty fellows, and medical school matriculants. Okay, so we're going to start with the status of the infectious diseases fellowship match. And so here are data from the past 5 years. On the left-hand bar, you'll see the total number of ID programs that submitted rank lists each year. The middle bar is the number of programs that filled all their spots in the match. And then the third bar is programs that did not fill in the match. I would say that the main takeaway from this slide is that on average, about 2/3 of ID programs fill their spots in the match each year. There's some variability around this, from 62%, for example, in 2020, up to 75% in 21, which was the first year after the pandemic, which I'll talk a little bit more about as the talk evolves. But in general, as a takeaway point, about 2/3 of programs fill. In terms of the total number of positions that fill, again, the main takeaway point here is that about 80% of the overall ID positions fill each year. You can see the left bar is the number of positions offered, middle is filled, and third is unfilled. Again, there's some variability from year to year. 21, again, was a particularly good year with 88% of the spots filling. But again, the main takeaway, I would say, is that about 80% of spots fill per year. So programs are going unfilled and spots are going unfilled. So that leads to a question of, do we have too many spots? Do we really need more infectious diseases physicians? And I think that these data would argue that the answer to that question is yes, maybe familiar to the audience, but these are some data published a couple of years ago now showing the average national density of ID physicians by county across the United States. And so what you can see in blue is that those are counties that have greater than the average national density of ID physicians. That number is 1.76 ID physicians per 100,000 persons. Just say as a frame of reference that the average number of resident physicians per 100,000 persons is 44 in the United States. So we're talking about an average for ID of 1.76. So the blue counties are above the national average. The red counties are below the national average density of ID physicians. And then the white counties, there's actually no ID physicians in those counties. So as you can see represented by this map, what this means is that 90% of counties in the United States, or 208 million people living in the United States, live in a place where there's either no infectious diseases physician or less than what is the national average of ID physicians by county. So I'm admittedly talking to a biased audience, but I think we can all agree that we do need more ID physicians. And so then that perhaps leads to the question of what might preclude trainees from pursuing careers in this incredible specialty. And this has been discussed in the past, and I won't belabor it, but I do want to highlight at least the financial aspect because I do think this is quite relevant here. This is a snapshot from the AAMC faculty salary report. I just took one aspect of it. So these are the most recent survey of associate professor salaries, and I'll draw your attention to the middle column in terms of median salary. Across these slides, I've bolded the different internal medicine subspecialties, and so you can see cardiology comes out at the top at just over $400,000 per year. And then I'm not going to read each one, but you can see some other internal medicine specialties here. Hospital medicine coming in at just over $260,000 on a median basis. And then nearly at the bottom is infectious diseases at just almost $217,000. You can see almost all other specialties in medicine earn more on a median basis at this level compared to ID. Not only other subspecialties, but also, hospital medicine, general internal medicine earn more. And so this begs to the question, of why someone might pursue either training in ID when they could pursue a different specialty and earn more, or just forego subspecialty training entirely and go right from residency into practice where their salaries would be higher. So this remains a problem. The ID Society, among many other groups, are working on this, but this is a reality that I think affects some of these data. On the flip side, these data are old now, but I would argue that they likely still hold in terms of physician satisfaction across a different number of specialties. So again, this is survey data from 20 years ago, but you can see across a wide range of specialties, self-reported satisfaction by ID physicians was third highest as compared with many, many other specialties. So it remains a rewarding and attractive field for folks who go into it, as in contrast to the financial realities that perhaps affect recruitment. So that's some background data that I think are relevant. And I wanted to switch now and talk about the impact of the pandemic on recruitment into ID and medicine specialties in general, because I think these data are interesting and somewhat surprising. So you see here data from the AAMC Electronic Residency Application Service, or ERAS. This is the way in which almost all applicants will apply for subspecialty training. You can see pre-pandemic data, but I'll draw your attention to the difference between the 2020 data and the 2021 data. That's the transition from pre to post-pandemic time. And you can see for some specialties like cardiology and hem-onc, there's a fairly sharp inflection point with an increase in the number of applicants to each program, with some lesser but still steady increases in GI and pulmonary and critical care medicine. Before going to the next slide, I'll just draw your attention to the y-axis in terms of the total number of applicants that programs in these specialties see, because it stands in sharp contrast to these specialties, as you'll see, but the trend overall is similar in terms of the impact of the pandemic in terms of the number of applicants seen by program, where there's a decline in rheumatology, but otherwise there are increases in endocrinology, nephrology, hospice, and palliative medicine, as well as infectious diseases. So I will say that as a program director, these data weren't necessarily surprising. We expected that with the transition to virtual recruitment, there would be more applicants to programs because it was the bar to application was lower. It was virtual interviewing rather than travel and so on. But that actually is not the entire story here. Some of it is a result of the transition to virtual recruitment. So you can see on this slide here, these are data regarding the number of applications submitted per applicant. And as expected, those numbers increased increased, although perhaps, at least from my perspective, not as much as we might have anticipated with the transition to virtual recruitment. So you see that the trends overall are continuing upwards in terms of the number of applications per applicant across all specialties. There aren't really substantial peaks between 20 and 21 for any specialty except for the two in the lower half, nephrology and hospice and palliative care medicine. If you actually look at the numbers, they went up a little bit, but the bottom line here is that on average, these numbers didn't really change that dramatically. What did change was the number of applicants to each specialty. So not the total number of applications submitted by each applicant, but the number of people applying to each specialty changed with the pandemic in a way that I think I and others found interesting. So before showing those data, I just show here, these are pre-pandemic data. You can see that for some specialties, there were year-over-year increases in the number of applicants across, for example, cardiology, GI, hospice and palliative care medicine, and pulmonary and critical care medicine, with some fluctuations across the other specialties, but for the most part, a general trend of increase over time. What we saw with the first year of the pandemic was this really sharp increase. Again, this is the total number of people applying to each specialty. So a shift to apply a greater proportion of folks applying for subspecialty training with the first year of the pandemic, not for every specialty, but for the majority of them, including infectious diseases, as you can see. And for the most part, those changes were sustained with the second year of recruitment after the pandemic. Sadly, ID has the lowest sort of continuity number here, as you can see, but for the other specialties, again, it's sort of fluctuation around zero, but for the most part, maintenance of the increases that we saw in 20 and 21. So there's more to come from this. I think it'll be interesting to see how things evolve as we get further away from the pandemic and virtual recruitment becomes more consistently entrenched. But interesting data, I thought, about recruitment during the pandemic. Okay, during my final few minutes, I'm just going to transition completely because one of the focal points of the discussion here is diversity, and I think it's important to understand where we're starting from when we talk about the need to enhance diversity across our and other specialties. So from a big picture perspective, by self-reported sex and race and ethnicity, here are data that were published now a couple of years ago. This has to do with internal medicine faculty from other specialties of medicine, and medical school matriculants. These data come from AAMC surveys, the matriculant data, and also on the next slide we'll talk about the United States Census data. Those are self-reported race, and then the faculty data are actually reported to the AAMC by individual institutions. So what we're doing here on this slide is comparing, but I don't think I have a good way to point. So what we're comparing is 1980 to 2018, and as you can see, the 1980 numbers are not good, everyone, but at least they got better from 1980 to 2018. So in 1980, 12% of faculty in academic medicine were women. That number increased in terms of internal medicine to over 40% in 2018, so that's good. You can see that other, actually non-internal medicine specialties did better than internal medicine over this time. Up to 43% of those faculty were women in 2018. At the medical school level, the data are even more encouraging. So this is, again, medical school matriculants. You can see by 2018, and we'll look at this again on the next slide, the majority of matriculants to medical schools in 2018 were women, which was the first time that had been seen in the past. The data for underrepresented minorities are definitely not as good. So sorry to not be able to use the pointer, but between 1980 and 2018, you can see the proportion of faculty that were underrepresented minorities increased from between 4 and 5% to just under 10%. The data for medical school matriculants is better, but still not what it should be, as we'll review. But 18% of medical school matriculants in 2018 identified as underrepresented minorities. I think particularly disappointing here is that in 1980, just over 11% of med school matriculants were underrepresented minorities, and even in 2018, we didn't see that proportion of representation among faculty in internal medicine or otherwise. So clearly, a lot to still do in this regard. These are the same data, just in graphical form and including the United States Census Bureau population level data. So again, medical school matriculants as of 2017, which was the most recent data at the time of this publication, exceeded the proportion of women in the general population and also were a majority at the medical school matriculant level. You can see the trends among non-internal medicine and internal medicine faculty have been increasing steadily over time, but still lagging behind medical school matriculants. And here are the data in terms of underrepresented minorities. You can see at a population level, they exceeded 30% of the population, but among medical school matriculants, again, around 18%, and then faculty were below 10%. So huge gaps and disparities here as compared with women, and important to reflect on, I think. Okay, finally, I'm just going to end with the internal medicine subspecialty data. So these are diversity by sex from GME survey data. This is spanning 1991 to 2016 among different specialties. What you can see is that the numbers increase across specialties, essentially across the board, but differences by specialty. So by 2016 in subspecialties, including endocrinology, geriatric medicine, rheumatology, and ID, there was a greater proportion of women than men in those individual specialties, and then a sharp difference with other specialties where women are the minority, such as cardiovascular medicine, gastroenterology, and pulmonary and critical care medicine. These are the same data. The only reason I include this slide is that this graph shows the dark colored circles in the center of the graph are the proportion of internal medicine residents that are women. So you can see that many specialties fall above that level, ID among them, and then others fall below, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide. And then data from a diversity perspective in terms of race and ethnicity from the GME survey data, again, in IM specialties. This is comparing different years. So 2006 was the first year that these data were collected, and then compared here to 2018. You can see there was an increase in the proportion of IM residents that were underrepresented in medicine in 2018, although not significantly so. The increases were significant across different specialties, but I think that this slide shows it perhaps a bit better. On the right-hand side of the slide are data in terms of the overall U.S. population. And so you can see that the proportion of the U.S. population that is underrepresented minorities, and then African American or Black, Hispanic or Latinx, Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and then American Indian or Alaska Native, as compared to all of the other IM subspecialties and the way in which they fall short of diversity in proportion to the population level. ID actually, as you can see, does relatively well from this perspective, with at least the greatest proportion of trainees that are underrepresented in medicine, but still, I think, a long way to go for all of these specialties. So speaking of a long way to go and the path forward, I will just make a couple of quick comments before my time is over. This has been written about previously, so Rochelle Walensky, Wendy Armstrong, Carlos Del Rio wrote about this a few years ago, talking about some possible paths here forward, including the possibility of combined training opportunities, financial aspects that may be relevant, including ID being part of the National Health Service Corps, the emphasis on reimbursement in ID generally that's ongoing, and then opportunities to enhance research training, which I know Emily will talk about in her comments. And then finally, the IDSA Foundation is launching an initiative to try to attend to some of these issues, both recruitment into ID generally, as well as diversification of the ID workforce. So I'm happy to be part of this group along with others, and I won't talk about it in too much detail, except to say the idea is to support and train and educate and prepare folks starting at the medical school level, early medical school, and perhaps even prior to that, as well as through the residency level, to try to encourage folks to pursue careers in infectious diseases. So in summary, we talked about the way in which there is a mismatch between the demand or need for ID physicians and the supply of those physicians nationally. There are many reasons that probably contribute to this, including compensation, as we talked about. There have been some interesting ramifications of the pandemic and virtual recruitment, with increased numbers of applications from applicants, perhaps as we suspected, but also somewhat surprisingly, the increased number of applicants to subspecialties like I talked about. And then there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of diversifying the ID workforce. Thanks very much for having me.